So as Marianne mentioned, my topic here is new media, new evangelization. To discuss that, we have to go all the way back to 19th century Germany. In 19th century Germany, the book was king. Anyone wanting a good story knew precisely where to turn, to the book. It had been about 400 years since Gutenberg invented his printing press. However, in those 4 centuries, the book had never really evolved as a storytelling device. After all, the 15th century book and the 19th century book looked almost identical. They had 2 hard covers, a stack of beige pages, and line after line of monotonous black text. But that was until a man named Lothar Meggendorfer entered the scene. I first discovered Meggendorfer through a storyteller named Joe Sabia and was instantly enthralled because Meggendorfer was the first person to survey this world of boring-looking books, to put his foot down and to say, "Genug ist genug." Enough is enough with these boring-looking stories. Meggendorfer was convinced that if we had stories worth telling, if we had ideas worth spreading, then the ways that we shared this content should be every bit as creative and evocative as the medium itself. Now, as you can imagine, Meggendorfer had plenty of critics, plenty of people who said, "Look, old man, stories will always be told through boring books, and so you just got to get used to it. You should just fold to the conventions of normalcy." But Meggendorfer was a radical. And so, like all radicals, he subverted the suggestions of his critics, and he grabbed his pen, he scooped up his scissors, and Meggendorfer decided to do just what his critics suggested. He decided to fold. You see, history will forever remember Lothar Meggendorfer as the first true inventor of the pop-up book. Now, all of a sudden, stories were charged with color, dimension, surprise, wonder. What were once bland stories trapped within the boring bounds of a book were now liberated, free to flourish and radiate in all of their splendor. The good news for us, however, is that this creative revolution did not stop with Meggendorfer, because in the very next century, a whole new generation of storytellers channeled Meggendorfer's creative spirit as they moved from the pop-up book to radio theater, to film in motion, to film with sound, to film in color, in 3D, on VHS, on DVD, and then to the internet. And from there, things got interesting. The internet meant that anyone could now share their stories in fresh, creative, innovative ways, easily, quickly, and cheaply. It meant, for instance, that Middle Eastern revolutionaries could share their tale of liberation in real time with the watching world. It meant that millions of people struggling with cancer could share their visceral pains and emotions with thousands of others walking the exact same path. And, as perhaps the greatest example of the internet's storytelling power, I give you this.
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style. Oppan Gangnam Style.
A South Korean pop sensation who gallops on an invisible horse and becomes a cultural phenomenon. How many of you have seen that video? You are part of the 1.4 billion people around the world who have. Curious fact, the Mayans predicted that the end of the world would occur. Does anybody know when? Remember that? A few months ago? December 21st, 2012. At 9 a.m. on December 21st, 2012, Gangnam Style crossed the 1 billion user threshold, making it the most watched video in the history of the world. Coincidence? Now, in 6,000 years of storytelling, we've gone from animal paintings on cave walls to Catholic parishes on Facebook walls. And in that time, the stories have not changed that much. We still tell stories about God and meaning, purpose, heroes, and lots of humor. But the way we tell these stories has changed dramatically. The question for all of us in this room, the question for the Catholic Church, is how do we tell our stories in fresh, creative ways? Like Meggendorfer wondered, how can we escape some of the boring mediums of the past and add new vigor and excitement to our age-old stories? How can we proclaim the gospel not just from the rooftops, but from the laptops? How can we share the word made fresh? That's what I'm going to talk about here today. Now, the church has answered those questions in the form of a movement called the New Evangelization. How many of you have heard of the New Evangelization? Likely almost everybody. It's become kind of a buzzword within the church. You can't go anywhere without hearing, yeah, we're going to have donuts and coffee for the New Evangelization, or, flyers or businesses or events, anything ties into the New Evangelization. But what is the New Evangelization? Where did it come from? And how does new media fit into it? That's what I'm going to start the beginning of this talk with. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to share 5 ways that we can use new media to evangelize. Practical tips that I've garnered from my many years of interacting with these tools, that each of us in this room can use new media to participate in the new evangelization. Now, to understand the new evangelization, we have to go back to 1959. It had only been a few months since Pope John the 23rd was elected, but he felt called by the Holy Spirit to announce a council of the church, a council that would become known as Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. Now, when he made the announcement of this council, he did so in a provocative way. At the press conference, which this is a picture of, he sat in front of a large globe. The globe would become somewhat iconic of the council's aim. This council, unlike previous councils, was not primarily about internal church issues, but was about how the church could engage the wider world. Many of the major documents have a definitively outward orientation, focused on evangelization, though the phrase wasn't used too often, just wondering new ways that we can share the age-old gospel with the wider world. Many of the council fathers like to use the image of Noah's Ark as a metaphor for what the council meant to do. So you remember, with the story of Noah's Ark, Noah was charged by God to bring all of the animals and God's good creation within the ark, and then to shut the doors and windows closed. But after the floods receded, after the rain stopped, the doors and the windows opened. Not so much to let the world in, but to let the life escape from the ark. That's what Vatican II was about, according to many of the fathers. At this announcement, Pope John used a phrase that would become popular throughout the council and even the title of one of its major documents. The phrase was Lumen Gentium, light of the nations. Again, using the Noah's Ark metaphor, the purpose of the council was to open the windows and the doors of the church, not so much to let the world in, but to let the Lumen Gentium escape. The church is the bearer of this light of the nations to the world, who we learn in Vatican II is Jesus Christ. And so from its very beginning, the Vatican Council was evangelistic. However, in the years following the council, it was wildly interpreted in many different, with many different viewpoints and with many different emphases. Lost in a lot of that discussion was this emphasis on evangelization. And so 10 years after the council ended, Pope Paul VI decided to call a synod of bishops from around the world to come to Rome and focus on the topic of evangelization. And so in 1974, hundreds of bishops came to answer questions like, why is it that in many parts of the world, the Catholic Church seems to be shrinking, while other religious faiths seem to be booming? Why is it that evangelistic methods that worked 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, don't seem to be working anymore? And why is it that we've lost that zeal, that fire for spreading the faith that characterized the early church? These are a lot of questions that we're still asking today. Now, in that synod, there was a young Polish bishop of Krakow named Karol Wojtyła. Pope Paul VI asked Archbishop Wojtyła to be the relator of this synod, the one tasked with controlling it, but also producing the final document summarizing all that was discussed. But when Archbishop Wojtyła was putting together this document, he ran into several problems. Anytime he would prepare what he thought was a well thought out and agreeable final draft, he would circulate it to all the fathers of this synod, and it would inevitably be returned filled with strike-throughs and comments, deletions and additions, and this happened over and over again. And so he went to the Pope and he said, Holy Father, this is a dead-end process. I'm not going to be able to reach a consensus. And Pope Paul VI decided to take matters into his own hands. And so 1 year later, in 1975, he wrote what is the most important document on evangelization in the history of the church. It was called Evangelii Nunciandi, on evangelization in the modern world. And in that document, the Pope reiterated the central focus of the church on evangelization. He says things like, the essential mission of the church is to evangelize. She exists, he says, to evangelize. So if you ever wonder, or if anyone asks, why the Catholic Church? What are we doing? What's the point? The church exists to evangelize. The church exists to bring people into a relationship with Jesus Christ, to proclaim the good news of the risen Lord. In that document, he reiterates this fact over and over again, that evangelization is not just one activity among many within the church, it is the thing. It is the center around which all the other energies, activities, missions, and ministries revolve around. It's interesting to note, too, that this is the first document that we see a mention and a commendation of technology. In a somewhat stinging and curious phrase, he says, quote, if the church does not use modern technology to evangelize, she will stand guilty before the Lord. Stinging, curious words. If we don't use all the technology that we have at our disposal, we'll have to answer for it to the Lord. Now, I mentioned that at that synod from which this document, Evangelii Nunciandi, emerged, there was this young bishop from Krakow. It should be no surprise then that when he became Pope in 1978, taking the name John Paul II, that he would make evangelization his central concern. He marinated in the stew of evangelization throughout Vatican II and the Synod, and from day one, he decided that his goal was to proclaim the Lord to the world. Pope John Paul II traveled to more countries and was seen by more people than any pope in the history of the world. In 1979, he went back to his homeland, Poland, a country racked with atheism, threatened by communism, a place that had no room for God and no interest in the risen Jesus. And there, to about 1 million people outside, he proclaimed his famous words, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid." It was during this speech that he first used the phrase new evangelization. He said, in this modern world, it's time for a reinvigoration of our energies toward a new evangelization. However, in the speech, he never really fleshed out what he meant by that phrase, and it wasn't until 1983, when speaking to a group of bishops in Haiti, that he unpacked what he meant. He gave a famous trifold description of the new evangelization. He said, the new evangelization is not a new message, but a new way of communicating it. That is new in ardor, zeal, fire, new in methods, and new in expressions. New in ardor, new in methods, new in expression. You can see in that definition how new media fits right into it. The new methods and the new expressions specifically. Pope John Paul was the first pope, obviously, to use the internet. The internet wasn't around before him. Al Gore hadn't gotten up to the task yet of putting it together. He also was the first pope to use a computer. And he spoke often about the value of the internet, not only to disseminating information, but to evangelize. In the very last document he wrote before he passed away in 2005, which was called The Rapid Development, he focused almost exclusively on the internet and the burgeoning new communications. And in that last document, kind of bringing his pontificate full circle, he used that famous phrase from 1978. And he said, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of new technologies." One of the biggest resistances to new media today within the church is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of negative feedback. And to all those concerns, Pope John Paul says, do not be afraid. On April 19th, 2005, we had a new pope elected, Pope Benedict XVI. And he decided to make his mission extending and amplifying that of his predecessor. Pope Benedict was deeply concerned about the new evangelization from day one and spoke about it and wrote about it as often as he possibly could. Pope Benedict described the new evangelization like this. He said, "The new evangelization is, quote, a re-proposal to the world of the perennial truth of Christ's gospel." A re-proposal to the world of the perennial truth of Christ's gospel. Now the first word is key to understanding what Pope Benedict meant by the new evangelization. It's a re-proposal to the world, meaning it's not the first time that people have heard this message. It's a reminding, a reissuing of something people once knew but have since dismissed or forgotten. In many ways, Pope Benedict said, it's an art of recovery. We look around the world, particularly the Western world, and see many countries that were historically Catholic, that had deep roots in the faith, but in recent years have pushed those roots to the side, cut them off at the top, and have drifted away from their religious background. The same dynamic is seen at the individual level. Many people who were baptized in the church and perhaps catechized, maybe even confirmed, were never really evangelized. And so after growing up in the faith, when they reach adolescence or they go off to college, they drift away from the faith that they were bathed in from their earliest times. The new evangelization, therefore, is helping people to recover, to remember what they once knew but have since thrown off. Pope Benedict, like his predecessor, was a huge fan of technology. He understood that the new media could help bring about this recovery. Here's the famous shot of him using the papal iPad to launch the first ever papal tweet. And you watch the video and it's quite funny because he's not quite, I don't think he understands what a touch screen is, and he's trying to touch all around it. He finally gets the right button, and the Twitter account Pontifex is now live around the world. He was also known to light the papal Christmas trees using a tablet computer. And in his speeches for the World Communications Day, which is coming, I guess it was just this past weekend here, he regularly wrote on the need for Catholics to use the internet and modern social media. In fact, before he abdicated the papacy, he crafted the message for this year's World Communications Day, which was last weekend. And so it was read all across the world, and the title of the message was Social Networks, Pathways and Spaces for Evangelization. Pope Benedict aligned several specific events to act as the definitive launching point for the new evangelization. We have, of course, the Year of Faith, which we find ourselves in, a celebration that lands on the anniversaries of both the Second Vatican Council, that evangelistic council meant to get the Lumen Gentium into the world, and the anniversary of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict has routinely explained that to share your faith, you got to know it. That's the mission of Catholic Distance University. To create Catholics who will transform the world, you first have to deeply know and understand its roots. He also did two things. He created a pontifical council for promoting the new evangelization, which was relatively unique. These councils don't come into being all the time. And also created a synod for bishops around the world, like in 1974, to discuss the new evangelization. What are the problems it faces, and how can we carry it out? We're still waiting for the summarizing document of that synod, but it's sure to be important. So with that history understood, what is the new evangelization? Summing it up, the new evangelization can be described like so. It's new in its aim. Past evangelization was primarily aimed at those who have never heard the gospel, people in foreign countries, people raised in secularized families. But the new evangelization is primarily aimed at those who are perhaps raised Catholic, but who have since become inactive, who have since thrown off the faith of their youth. The new evangelization is also new in who does it. 50 years ago, evangelization was thought to be the role of priests, bishops, professional missionaries, but the new evangelization is for everybody. Priests, yes, but religious, and especially the laity. A lot of us in here. The new evangelization is the task of us all. The new evangelization is new also in its context. We live in a new world that faces different challenges, different threats than the world of 20, 30, 40 years ago. And to evangelize effectively means understanding the modern world. And finally, the new evangelization is new because of the methods, the expression, and the ardor with which it's carried out. It's new because of technologies like the new media. That's what we'll move into next. Now, 4 days after Pope Benedict XVI was elected Pope, 2 young men made their way to the San Diego Zoo. Armed with a video camera, they walked back to the elephant exhibit, and this was the result.
Alright, so here we are in front of the elephants. And the cool thing about these guys is that they have really, really long trunks, and that's cool. And that's pretty much all there is to say.
Undoubtedly one of the most profound videos you've likely encountered. If you couldn't hear, this was the message. We're here at the elephant exhibit, and the cool thing about these guys is that elephants have really, really, really long trunks, and that's about it. Innocent, seemingly, but what these 2 young men could not have known was that their video, the first one ever on a brand new website called YouTube, would launch a digital revolution. 8 years and millions of videos later, YouTube has grown to become the world's largest video website and the 2nd largest search engine in the world, behind only Google. Every single day, people head to YouTube to watch more than 8 billion videos. Last year, the astounding thing about YouTube is that it's not stagnant. It's growing every single minute. Every minute, 70 hours of new video is added to the website, which means that in just 1 month, more video is added to YouTube than ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox have created in their entire histories combined. In 1 month, more video is added to YouTube. Facebook is the world's most popular website, period, and the world's most popular social network. It sports over 1 billion users who go online to share notes and pictures and videos and funny cat graphics. half of those 1 billion users log in every single day. Twitter is the fastest growing social network. It's a place where users can exchange tweets. Now, these are short, pithy messages of 140 characters or less. So that means that all the letters, numbers, symbols, spaces in your message have to add up to less than 140. Every single day, 400 million unique tweets are exchanged on Twitter. And then there's text messaging, a phenomenon I probably don't have to tell you much about. Last year, we sent and received 8 trillion text messages. 8 trillion text messages, 7.9 trillion of which were sent by young teenage girls. In all seriousness, the phenomenon is most defined among young people. In 2012, the average American teenager sent and received 110 text messages per day. 110 per day. I was speaking to a group of parents about new media one time, and I gave them that statistic, and the faces I got were kind of, and I said, you know what, does that seem kind of high? And they said, no, our kids send way more than that. That seems really low. All of these technologies have radically transformed the ways that we communicate. Though it's often uttered, it's true. This is the greatest communication shift since Gutenberg's printing press. Lothar Meggendorfer would not have known what hit him if he saw things like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. The majority of the world is now using these tools as a primary way to communicate, and for the church, that's extremely beneficial. If we exist to evangelize, if evangelization is our central mission, then there are few greater gifts that we can have than tools like this. Tools which allow us, again, to communicate easily, quickly, and cheaply. As I promised in the beginning, what I'm going to do for the last part of this talk is to give you some examples of how we can do just that. I'm going to unveil what I consider to be my 5 keys to evangelizing with the new media. I mentioned earlier that I've been blogging now for 5 years, and for those who aren't familiar with the term blog, I have to explain that it's not a sound that you make when you're gagging or coughing. That's in fact an important mode of communication. A blog is somewhat like a website that has short articles in reverse chronological order, usually, so the newest one's at top. But the defining feature is that it's a two-way form of communication. So if I write an article, there's something called a comment box at the bottom where anybody can come and critique, usually, add their 2 cents, agree sometimes, and build a discussion around whatever topic is at play. I began blogging in 2007 while I was a Protestant, and I would write about Protestant spirituality, and blogs played an integral role in me coming to the Catholic Church. Because when I first started looking into Catholicism, I knew very few Catholics, and so I turned where most people turn when they have questions, Google and the internet. And those led me to blogs, and I started reading Catholic websites and interacting with people in the comment boxes. And what I loved was that I could ask very specific questions and received customized answers. If I had a question, say, about Mary, I didn't just go find a general article explaining or defending a Marian dogma. I could ask about a very specific struggle I had and have somebody walk through me, oftentimes through multiple comments threads about that issue. So when I converted to the church in 2008, I kept up this practice of blogging, but of course began blogging about Catholic matters. And over the last 5 years, my blog has grown to become somewhat significant, to where now I've had thousands of posts and thousands of interactions with people in the comment boxes. And so through that experience and my experience on other sites like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, these 5 keys are gleaned. So key number 1, ground yourself on Christ. We remember our Lord telling us in the Gospel of John that I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will produce much fruit. But without me, you can do nothing. Without me, you can do nothing. Now that's such an important concept for evangelization as a whole, but especially on the internet. How many of you have ever fell into the deadly disease known as angry email syndrome? I hear laughs, so I'm assuming that means I'm not the only one. How many of us have posted a flippant, spontaneous comment in the heat of the moment to something we've read online, or sent off an email that we later regretted? Whenever we have discussions about faith or morals on the internet, this key principle from John is so vitally important. I've seen in my own evangelistic work online that whenever I kind of separate the spiritual matters from the digital matters, I end up in a whole lot of trouble. I end up with regret, nastiness, and failure. But when I attune myself to the Lord's voice, I find that I'm much more effective. Whenever I'm writing a blog post, if I say a quiet prayer like, Lord, should I post this? Is this the right topic? Is it the right time? Should I respond to this guy? Or should I just let go of it? This guy's really bugging me. What should I do about it? It's those times of listening and asking for the Lord's wisdom that I'm most effectively able to respond. And so this key grounds all the rest. If new media is just secular dabbling in new technological mediums, then you'll be just as successful as any secular technology person. But if your fuel and your fire comes from the Lord Jesus, you'll be tremendously more effective. The second key, though, is to learn the new media, to learn it. Now, what's interesting about this online culture is that each of these tools is almost like a different language. And I don't just mean the words used on each of these sites, but I mean the style, the tone, the form. In the 9th century, there were two saints who were brothers, Saints Cyril and Methodius. They were evangelists, missionaries, sent out to reach the Slavic people of Great Moravia. But they faced a problem when they visited this native tribe. They discovered that the people, though able to converse, had no written language. They could speak eloquently, they could read other languages partially, but they had no language of their own. Now, this was problematic for the two saints who wanted to come in and bring the Bible and other liturgical texts because they could not share information easily. And so over about a year or two, they carefully studied the ways that the people spoke, noting the subtleties and the nuances of their language, their imagery. And they created an entire alphabet from the ground up, based slightly on the German. The language is still in use in some parts of the world, the Cyrillic alphabet, and it came from these evangelist saints. Once they had a written language, then they could begin the important work of evangelization. Their model is a good one for us today. To use these tools effectively, we got to learn the language. One of my friends, I think, has done this extremely well. He's a young guy about my age named Ryan Scheel. And Ryan was extremely savvy with building websites, very familiar with the internet culture, and had a deep understanding of the new evangelization. He knew that it needed new methods, new expressions, new ardor. And so studying this language of the internet, he recognized that there was one specific form of communication on the internet that was especially likely to spread quickly, to go viral. It was called the meme. How many of you have heard of memes? Memes, the phrase ironically, comes from the world's most popular atheist, a biology professor, Richard Dawkins. But in internet parlance, a meme is usually some sort of graphic or video that is funny, humorous. It's got sarcastic or ironic text, something like that. And Ryan saw that these memes spread like wildfire on websites like Facebook. That when somebody created a funny picture and added some text and put it on their Facebook profile, within hours it could have tens of thousands of shares and likes and views. So he said, what if, like St. Cyril and Methodius, we appropriated this medium and used it for our purposes? What if we spread the lumen gentium through the memes? And so he created a website called CatholicMemes.com, and it also has a Facebook page that has since grown to become the largest Catholic Facebook page on the internet. It's got over 85,000 fans. And when you go to this page, you'll see things like this. What part of Catholics don't worship Mary do you not understand? You also see things like this. No shave November, Capuchin's not impressed. What's interesting about these sorts of memes is that to the average person who has no familiarity with Catholicism, Ryan has many Protestants, atheists, agnostics, secularists of every stripe who subscribe to these images. When any of them see an image like this, they know what a meme is, and so they know it's supposed to be funny. They know there's a joke somewhere in there. But to get the joke, you got to understand the terms. So they see capuchins and they think, what is that, a monkey? That doesn't make sense. There's no monkeys in this picture. And so they go where all of us go to get our answers, Google, and they type in the phrase capuchins to try and learn what the meaning of this joke is. Now all of a sudden, you have thousands of people looking up a religious order on Google, unintentionally evangelized through something as simple as a meme. On Ryan's site, you'll also see ones like this. Jeremiah 15:16 with a dog standing in front of a bunch of paper. Now, if you haven't memorized the great prophet Jeremiah, you'll be glad to discover that this verse says, "When I found your words, I devoured them." Now, that same dynamic with the capuchins holds here too. By understanding the language of memes, Ryan's created something that now requires somebody to open up the Bible to get the joke. And so you have, again, atheists, agnostics, Protestants, who know that this is supposed to be funny, who are all of a sudden going to the USCCB's Bible website or Googling Jeremiah 15:16 and are reading verses of Scripture, even though the morning they woke up, they never thought that they would be reading the Bible. Finally, you'll see ones like this. Now, this is a popular meme called the awkward penguin. There's thousands of these. And the penguin is always caught in some embarrassing situation. So this one says, meant to read out 1 John 4:18 at a wedding, reads John 4:18 by mistake. Now, 1 John 4:18 is that beautiful, beautiful wedding verse that perfect love casts out fear. Isn't that nice? John 4:18, however, says that, build up to the climactic moment. You are right in saying, I do not have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. Now again, to get that joke, you got to look in the Bible, not just once, but twice. And so you have thousands and tens of thousands of people who would see this on their Facebook page and say, all right, it's the awkward penguin. I know it's going to be good. But to get the joke, I got to look up 2 verses, one in the Gospels and one in the Epistles. Ryan, I think, is the perfect example of somebody who understood that you got to first learn the new media, learn to speak the languages, understand the online culture, and then take advantage of it to evangelize. The third key to evangelizing online is to baptize your social media. In 1914, there was a young atheist right outside of Oxford in England, and he was making his way to a used bookstore at a train station, and he came across an obscure fantasy novel called Fantasies, written by George MacDonald. And this young atheist was certainly antagonistic toward anything that was explicitly Christian. But what he found in this novel was something surprising. Its author, George MacDonald, was a deep Christian who tried to inject all of his fictional works with Christian themes, not explicitly, but implicitly, so that the readers would absorb themes like redemption, sacrifice, salvation, and the great virtues of faith, hope, and love. The young atheist, Jack, would later say that when he read this book for the first time, something in him changed. He described it as my imagination becoming baptized. He said, I didn't know it was Christian, but from that moment on, I saw the world in a whole new way. I saw it through this Christian lens. So later on in my life, he would write, when I became a Christian, I was fully prepared because the seeds had been planted early. Jack, this atheist, would later become known as C.S. Lewis, the writer of the great Chronicles of Narnia series and many Christian apologetical works. The same thing that happened to Lewis needs to happen on the internet. Now, how many of you have a Facebook profile? How many of you are on Facebook? Good, almost everybody. One way to easily and simply evangelize through Facebook and through some of these other social media tools is to baptize them. Dip your accounts in the waters of Catholicism and have them sometimes explicitly, but more often implicitly, share your faith. Now, you can do this in one of many ways. One thing I like to encourage people to do is read some Catholic blogs and maybe once a day find one article that really resonates with you and share a link to it on your Facebook profile. You don't even have to add commentary, just share it and let it get out and see what kind of reactions you get. Maybe include a quote from your favorite saint or a line from this morning's Mass readings that really struck you. Now, all of this will have the explicit effect of getting Catholic content out into the wider digital world, but just as importantly, it will publicly identify you as a Catholic. This is crucial because a lot of times you'll find that most of the people you're connected with online never have any interactions with Catholics who take their faith seriously. They don't know anybody who cares about their faith, much less is willing to live by its standards and requirements. By making yourself known as somebody who is constantly thoughtful and concerned about their faith, they'll remember you whenever they have religious or moral questions. This has happened to me several different times. It's happened to me online where almost everybody now knows me as the Catholic. You know, I have friends who I've known since growing up who never cared about religion, but who have since sent me private messages or questions out of the blue because they knew that I was Catholic from the things I shared online. I work as an engineer full-time, and in my little cubicle, I have a bust, a little statue of John Paul II, and I have a small copy, a condensed copy of the Summa Theologica, which I read, a short snippet every now and then, sitting on my desk. Those things are important to me, but just as important, whenever somebody around the office comes and stops at my desk, they know by the imagery they see around that I'm Catholic. And it's had the same effect. That guys in my office know that I am a faithful, devout Catholic, and so they ask me questions about Catholicism. When the Pope was elected, I was kind of the de facto expert in the office. Probably many of you became the Catholic expert on this among your circles of friends. And so baptizing your social media is important because it establishes you as the Catholic, and maybe the only Catholic that many of the people you're connected with will interact with. Baptizing your social media, though, also means just scattering little seeds. Remember Jesus' great parable of the sower? A sower went out and threw some seeds. Some fell in the thorns, and it was strangled right as the plant came up. Some fell on rocky ground, and it was scorched by the sun. But, some fell on good path, and it produced fruit 30-fold, 50-fold, 100-fold. The internet is a lot like that. If you post stuff on your Facebook page, if you start a blog, if you're sending out Twitter messages, it can be a lot like scattering these seeds because you have no idea what sort of ground they'll land on. I've been blogging now for about 5 years. Many of my posts will get tons of views, thousands of views, and like 2 comments. One from an atheist who says, "You're an idiot." One from somebody else who said, "Hey, nice post, thank you." But what happened to those thousands of other people that read it? What sort of effect did it have on them? Did it help them? Were they intrigued by it? Did it cause them to take a step closer to the Lord or to the church? I'll never know. But like the sower, all we're called to do is scatter the seeds. To use St. Teresa's lingo, to scatter little flowers of love, unsure where they'll fall, unsure what the results will be, but letting the Lord take care of that. It's important to note this because it can be very discouraging a lot of times online. You can write a blog for like 3 years and have like 15 readers. And you can feel like you're not making any difference at all because you don't see any of the results. You don't get any of the feedback. But like the sower, like St. Therese, we're called, and as Mother Teresa would say, not to be successful, but to be obedient, to throw the seeds, to throw the flowers. The fourth key to evangelizing online is to know the culture. To know the culture. Karl Barth, a popular Protestant theologian of the 20th century, had this great image. He said, Christians should have the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand. You should be able to speak spiritual truths in a relevant way into the culture. I have a picture up here. This isn't Karl Barth. This is Batman. As an example of one way to speak into the culture. Father Robert Barron, who Mary Ann mentioned at the beginning, is, I think, the best example of evangelizing the culture, and specifically doing it online. Father Barron produces these YouTube vignettes, these short videos, about 7 to 9 minutes long, once a week. He's been doing it for years. And in every video, he engages some instance of popular culture, maybe a new book, a current event, a theological subject that's in vogue, or even a new movie like The Dark Knight Rises. And what he does is tries to find what the church fathers, the earliest theologians in the church, called the seeds of the word. The early church fathers recognized that even in the pagan cultures, there were seeds of truth, goodness, and beauty, touch points that we could use as a bridge to reach the secular culture. Touch points like The Dark Knight. And so when reviewing this video, Father Barron would note, for instance, the Christological character of Batman, how he represents Christ coming down to earth, saving it through a sacrificial act, and then ascending back up. And if you've seen the final Dark Knight Rises film, you know what I mean. What's important about his work, though, and he'll be the first to tell you this, is that nothing else he has done in his dozens of years of preaching and evangelizing has been as effective at reaching those outside of the church. Remember, the new evangelization is not primarily aimed at Catholics within the church, but those who have left, and also, to a certain extent, atheists and agnostics, non-believers. These YouTube videos attract thousands of comments. This one, you can't see the comments. It's got 22,000 views, and I think it's got a couple thousand comments. And in these comment boxes, Father Barron kind of gets at it with some of his atheist interlocutors, you know, differing over interpretations about a film, or they would say, how could you believe in this mythical fairy tale deity? But it's an opportunity for Father Barron to respond. Many of these atheists would never, in their wildest dreams, frequent any of our institutions. They would never knock on the door of a rectory and ask to talk to a priest. They would never show up for a lecture at a parish or one like this. But they're willing to go onto an anonymous site like YouTube and discuss religious matters. These tools help us to engage the culture, and specifically those we would otherwise never be able to reach. I'll give you one more example of this engaging the culture in action. This is a personal example. On my blog, as I mentioned, I kind of have a lot of interactions with atheists and agnostics. I don't know why they flock to my blog. I'm like an atheist magnet for some reason. And most of the commentary, the overwhelming amount of commentary is negative. But one phrase that I heard one day really struck me. One of my atheist commenters said, how could you be a part of the Catholic Church? The Catholic Church is the greatest evil in the world. Now, I hear like nasty derogatory things all the time, and I was tempted just to let it slide right off. But something that he said just rubbed me the wrong way. I thought, how could you look at all the great good the Catholic Church does and arrive at this conclusion that the Catholic Church is the greatest evil in the world? Well, I let it go and I didn't respond, noting that first key, you know, grounding yourself on Christ. Lord, should I respond? No, it's dumb, don't respond. But a couple days later, I got another comment from a different person who said, you know, I can't believe, you know, you guys, the Catholic Church is the greatest evil in the world. Again. I thought, this is really strange. A couple days later, a third person said the Catholic Church is the greatest evil in the world. And so I said, these people cannot be engaging in objective scholarly research, examining all the pros and cons of the Catholic Church, and individually arriving at the conclusion that the Catholic Church is the greatest evil in the world. They must be getting it from somewhere. And so I went where all of us go to get our answers, Google, and I searched the phrase Catholic Church, greatest evil in the world, and was surprised, though I shouldn't have been, to discover that it originated from Richard Dawkins. I mentioned him earlier. He's the world's most notorious atheist. He's a professor of biology at Oxford University, an author of the philosophically rigorous book, The God Delusion. So Richard Dawkins, in an offhanded interview, said, "The Catholic Church is the greatest force for evil in the world." And so I started thinking about this. If this is the popular perception among non-believers of the Catholic Church, primarily because of what they find on the internet and through sites like Google, what if we could change that story? What if we reversed that cultural momentum and told a different story about the Catholic Church? And so I decided to create a blog post, and I titled it, "Is the Catholic Church the greatest evil in the world?" Question mark. In the body of the post, I said, "Is the Catholic Church the greatest evil in the world?" Question mark. I said, "Popular atheist Richard Dawkins thinks so, but you tell me." And I included a video highlighting all of the church's great charitable work, universities, orphanages, you name it around the world, all the great good she brings. And then tagged the post. You can add little keyword summaries, greatest evil in the world, just to reinforce that phrase. Much to my surprise, in less than 24 hours, and this still holds true now, if you got a cell phone or a computer or whatever, you can check it out and verify it. If you go on Google and you search greatest evil in the world, my blog is the #1 result. Which means, yeah, thank you. Which means, according to Google, you are looking at evil incarnate. If you search greatest evil in the world. What this means, though, is that many of those atheists who are perhaps looking for that quote from Richard Dawkins are going to go on Google, are going to search that phrase, and are going to be told a different story. Remember Pope Benedict's phrase, the new evangelization is a re-proposal to the world, a retelling of a story that has spun out of control. The fifth and final key to evangelizing online is to go to the Areopagus. Perhaps, how many of you have heard the word Areopagus? Very good. It was in the liturgy a couple days ago. It comes from the 17th chapter of Acts. And in that, we learn the story of St. Paul's trip to Athens, Greece. Upon landing at Athens, St. Paul goes into the synagogue and dialogues with the Jews. He enters the marketplace and talks with people about this strange, surprising message of Jesus risen from the dead. But then it's suggested that he go to the Areopagus. Now the Areopagus, we learn, is the place where the brightest of the bright, the most brilliant pagan philosophers in the heart of Athens, which was the intellectual hub of the ancient world, hung out, as the Bible says, to discuss new things. Now, how about that? That sounds like a lot like the internet. All they did all day was discuss new things. St. Paul marched his way up to the Areopagus, and as he did, he took note of the seeds of the word, looking at different examples that he could use as touch points to evangelize. And so he noted, for instance, their profound religiosity. They had many statues, many altars, even an altar to an unknown God. He also was familiar with their own philosophers and poets. And so when it was his turn to speak in front of this crowd on top of the Areopagus, he began by proclaiming Jesus, the Son of the Creator God, whom you worship as the unknown God. He essentially says, you have this altar to the unknown God. I'm here to tell you who that God is. Now, St. Paul was no fool. He knew that when he was going into this pagan crowd full of these people who really were not concerned with the truth, they were just interested in new ideas, he knew he would be likely laughed at, mocked, dismissed, scorned. And that happened. We read in Acts that most of the people said, "Get him out of here, what's this fool doing here?" But we also discover that there were some who said, quote, "You bring some strange notions to our ears, and we should like to hear more about that. Can you come back tomorrow?" He did. And we discover that he made a few converts. Scripture tells us Dionysius, Damaris, and a few others, it says. Now, objectively, it looks like a failure. St. Paul made his way all the way to Athens, climbed all the way up the Areopagus, and all he has to show for it are a few people who he converted to Christianity. Until we realize that these were the first Christians in Europe. The seeds of European Christianity, which spread not just throughout Europe, but eventually throughout the world. The internet is, as Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI have described it, a sort of digital Areopagus. It's a foreign and at times antagonistic place where many new ideas are discussed. Our mission is therefore to follow St. Paul into this Areopagus, knowing that our message is likely to be laughed at in many sectors, maybe mocked, scorned, dismissed, but nevertheless convinced that there will be some who will say, "You bring some strange notions to our ears. We'd like to hear more about that." Marianne mentioned at the beginning that I just launched a new website to do specifically this. And for this last key, I'd like to suggest that you maybe check out this website and consider participating in some of the dialogue that occurs. The website is called strangenotions.com, and here's a little video of the site. The aim of Strange Notions is to do exactly what St. Paul did 2,000 years ago. To go into a foreign territory like the internet and to engage people who are interested in these ideas of God and faith and reason, morals, art, and more, and to discuss with them the intriguing, strange notions that many on the internet can't help but avoid. Many of you here are graduating tomorrow with this great knowledge you've learned over the last several years and are trying to discover ways to implement it. How do you take advantage of all that you've learned and help spread it far and wide? Well, I'd suggest the internet is one of the primary answers. Go to places like YouTube. Go to places like Facebook. Go to the comment boxes on different blogs and newspaper articles. Go to comment boxes on sites like Strange Notions. And take St. Paul's lead. Dialogue with people. Help through a conversation following the model of Jesus and Socrates, and lead people gently to the truth. That finally brings us all the way back to our old friend, Lothar Meggendorfer. Meggendorfer, remember, was convinced that if we had a story worth sharing, if we had ideas worth spreading, then we should do so in creative, innovative, evocative ways. Our church has been telling us the same thing up and down the last few decades. The Second Vatican Council was an impetus to get the Lumen Gentium out into the world. Pope Paul VI reminded us that evangelization is the central mission of the church. She exists to evangelize. Pope John Paul II embodied it, telling the world, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of new technologies. Pope Benedict XVI and now Pope Francis have continued that trajectory, tweeting and blogging and paving the way for a new generation of evangelists. What they've done, I encourage you to do too, to set sail on these digital seas, to journey up the mountain of the digital Areopagus, and to not be afraid. Thank you.